Good morning, everyone. Yeah, fancy talking about mental health to pastors just after you've heard about will making. It's a very interesting place to start. So, I've been introduced, Ayodele Ajayi. I'm a consultant psychiatrist. I work with the NHS and also run a group for Black ethnic minority people to support with mental health, and particularly relating to church communities. And my dear sister Ayo, is in the process of transitioning to become a counselor, and she's seeing clients, and those are the things that we're going to be sharing with you today. So we are talking about looking after the mental health of our young people. And we didn't come casually, because we know that mental health is not something we like to talk about in church. It doesn't happen here, but we do know that from our shared experience that those are the things that they are realities. So, cool. I have something to change the slides, please. Good. Thank you. So I'm going to start. They say that a story, a gripping story, can actually tell your story more than 1,000 slides can do. And I'm going to start by sharing an experience that I had actually in clinic yesterday. A man in his mid-60s had been asked to see them. The GP said, please review their medication. That was the request. And the man comes into the consultation, he comes with his wife, and we begin to, I hadn't met him before, I'd just taken over that GP patch. So it meant that I was seeing him afresh, I needed to know the whole story. In the process of talking to me, it was very clear that he was extremely self-critical. It was very apparent. So I told him, I said, I can see that you are very self-critical. I'm just wondering where that comes from. As soon as I said that, there was still silence in the room. We could almost cut the silence in the room with a knife. And then the next thing that happened, none of us in the room was prepared for it. He just burst out sobbing. So we were all perplexed. What's happening in the room? What's happening here? Why is he sobbing? And then he said, so when he composed himself together, he said, you see, my dad was a very brilliant man, but I couldn't connect with him. It turns out that all his life, what he had been doing for the last 54 years, he said, actually, nobody has asked me those questions before. You really got me today. And that actually for the last 54 years, he had been trying to match up with his dad. He had been trying to be good enough. That's what he had been doing all his life. He then went on to tell us a story about the fact that when he was 9 years old, he moved from one part of the country to the other part of the country. And he had to be put into boarding school by his parents. It wasn't what he wanted. He was only 9 years old. And boarding school is another story. We won't go there today. He then went into boarding school, and he was there for 18 months. It was harrowing for him, but he said, I didn't have that type of relationship with my parents in order to be able to tell them. He then started sobbing again. And when we could then piece together the story of his life, how he got to where he was in the consultations. But that's just to start us off. Now, this slide, the reason why I wonder what our thoughts are from looking at this. This is the instruction we are usually given when you enter the airplane. And they will usually say, put on your child's mask first before you put on your own. Put on your own mask first before you put on your child's. Apart from praying for our children, I'll say 1 Thessalonians 5:23 over our children, the next best thing we can do to them to ensure that they are mentally stable and socially balanced adults is to give them the gift of our own mental wellness and our own emotional well-being. Children form views about themselves, about others, and about the world in their childhood. And the most crucial part of that is the home environment that they grew up in. Their experiences, their education, and the environment particularly. And we as parents are the ones that determine that. The good thing is that if there is a defect in that, there can be a compensating relationship. The grandparents can compensate, an uncle can compensate, an aunt can compensate. It's about having a relationship. It's about having a safe, sensitive space where that child can feel comfortable. Now, the next thing is who is the child. The challenge is that the definition, the legal definition of a child does not match with the neuroscientific definition of a child. It's easy for the government to say when a child becomes 18, they automatically become adults. That's not true, because neuroscience does not show that. Neuroscience shows that the brain continues to develop until your third decade of life. That in fact, there are very crucial parts of the brain, the place where you have your executive function, the places that determine your disinhibition, your complex decision making. They're actually the last part of the brain that develops. So suddenly a child becomes 18 and we think, oh, unky they are now adults. They are adults because that's what the legal framework says. They are adults because that's what the health system says. They are adults because that's what the HMRC says. But they are not adults because what's going on in their brain, the brain suddenly doesn't switch and say it's 18. So all the processes are adults because they are not. After COVID, the Office of Health Improvement and Disparities, they carried out a survey of all the adults in the they carried out a survey, not on all the adults, but a good cross-section of adults in the UK. What did they find? They wanted to find out what the impact of COVID was on mental health of the population. They stratified us into age groups, and what they found was that the 18 to 35 age group were the worst affected in their mental health as a result of the pandemic. What I'm trying to tell us is that our young adults are also included in this. Okay, so good. Just to say, in terms of statistics, the World Health Organization tells us that 50% of mental illnesses are actually there by the age of 14, and that by the age of 12, by the mid-20s, 75% of them are present. So when we see somebody in their 50s, in their 60s come into consultation with depression, we think, oh yeah, he didn't just suddenly become depressed. It was all there from way back. It was like a loaded gun. It was just waiting for an opportunity to pull. And when the trigger is pulled, when the situation is right, there's an explosion. 10% of people, of school children, actually have a diagnosable mental illness. Now, this is where it becomes relevant to us as people who look after families, who deliver marriage counseling, who also have children and grandchildren, and who are people of color in the UK. The statistics shows that the most affected when it comes to black people or people of color is not the first generation, it's actually the second generation. We made a decision. Okay, I'm second generation, so maybe I'm not, but most of us, we made a decision to come to the UK. But our children didn't make that decision. But some of them are bearing the consequences of it. Because when people come in, they have to settle, they deal with immigration problems, they deal with settling in. And sometimes that means that because of that stress, we are not available. And because we are not available, the impact is on those children. Right, so what's mental health? I can see that time is just running. So what is mental health? This is a deliberate slide because it's like a jumble. There's so many things on there, and you're thinking, what exactly is mental health? What exactly is mental health? The WHO says it's a state of well-being in which an individual is able to fulfill their potential. They're able to cope with the normal stresses of life. Immigration, moving from one country to the other, having to settle down, COVID. There's nobody who's currently alive who cannot say that they've not been traumatized in their lives, because the COVID lockdown is a trauma. It was a global trauma. So living with all the stresses of life and doing all that, those are the things that are important. But it's also about the fact that they are able to fulfill their potential and they're able to work productively. Many times we think about, many times we think about mental health and we think, Anybody who doesn't have a diagnosis has a good mental health. No, that's not correct. Every day in our churches, every day in our communities, we see people who have no diagnosis, but they are poor, they have poor mental health. Things have happened in their lives that has caused them to be broken. Parents have said certain things. They've been bullied, they've been physically, mentally, and emotionally abused, and sexually abused, and they are carrying those scars, and they haven't ever spoken to it. I once had a consultation where a man had never spoken about anything in his life. He never talked about it until about 50 years on. And it doesn't mean that because we didn't talk about it, that it's not there. It's just waiting for the right time. When the trigger is pulled, it comes out. So sometimes we see people, it's difficult for them to maintain relationships. The marriage is in fracas. The man cannot be emotionally vulnerable. It can be physically intimate, but not psychologically intimate, because things have happened to him. And we think that person, he doesn't have a diagnosis, he doesn't, so he's well. But that's not correct. The other bit I wanted us to look at is people who have a diagnosis with severe mental illness, but they're able to cope and they have a positive mental health. So the fact that people have a diagnosis does not automatically write them off and say they don't have good mental health. The Ted Turners of this world. Ted Turner was the founder of CEO. He still lives with the diagnosis of bipolar affective disorder, and now he's got Lewy body dementia. Sir Winston Churchill, he wrote 43 books whilst in office as Prime Minister, and then won a Nobel laureate, Nobel Prize in Literature, and yet he had bipolar affective disorder. In fact, people say that the reason why he was brave enough to lead Britain to war was because of some of these things. Some historians actually believe that. So mental illness is when somebody breaks their bone, we can look at their bone and say, oh, let's do an X-ray. Where do we look at when there's a mental illness? We look at the areas of emotion, we look at the areas of thought, and we look at the areas of behavior. Many times is an interlink of those areas. And the other thing to find out is that it's not, everybody has a bad day sometimes. Sometimes you're overwhelmed, sometimes you're stressed. But it becomes a problem, it becomes mental illness when it affects our functioning, when the family is affected, when the work is affected, when the ministry is affected. That's when it becomes a huge issue. And that's when it needs attention. Okay. So what causes mental illness? The way to summarize it is nature, nurture, narcotics, and negative life events. And the one that we really want to talk about today is actually nurture, the way we bring up our children, the way we nurture them. There's what is called negative adverse childhood experiences. Adverse childhood experiences are any negative events that happens in the life of a child, either stressful or traumatic. It could be physical abuse, it could be emotional abuse, it could be sexual abuse, it could be any form of abuse, it could be death of a parent. It could also be that a parent is living with a mental illness, or it could also be that there's another child in the family who has extra needs, such that the need of that child is compromised. We focus so much on one child, and the other children then becomes at a disadvantage. And then toxic home environment, undermining children, not validating their feelings, cultural clashes. Baba referred to that a lot yesterday. Yelling, screaming, we like to do all those things. Sometimes I speak to people and they say, my parents are always angry. I don't even know what it's all about. They discipline me, they don't communicate, it's not commensurate, and they're just screaming and shouting, and I don't even know what I've done wrong. And guess what? Those children carry those things in their memories. It's something that they don't get over. Yes, consequences of adverse childhood events. Generational impacts. So those things are actually stored up in their cells and they pass it on to the next generation. We parent by default the way we were parented. And then mental problems. Physical problems, actually, adverse childhood experiences, when they are not addressed, they make people at high risk of heart disease later on in life, diabetes, immunosuppression, some of those things, people come into consultations, and actually the cardiologist will then send somebody to me and say, this one is not just physical. There is an emotional, And then the other thing is that they also found out that when people have more than 4 advanced life experiences, their longevity is something that's at stake because they are likely to live at least up to 20 years less than the normal population. What can we do? There's a lot we can do. Just to round up this, we thought we will share some resources. One of the challenges that we experience when we talk to Christians, to people from the Black community as well, or just generally Christians, they say, I don't want them to brainwash my children. I don't want them to brainwash me. They are not going to be people of faith. They don't understand my Christian faith. This, the Spurgeon's thing, that one is actually, that organization was started by Charles Spurgeon, and it provides mental support to families looking from the Christian faith point of view. There is Every Mind Matters, which is the government one. There are several videos on there that actually talks, and particularly for children. After COVID, they uploaded a lot of anxiety, depression, lots of things on there. Young Minds is also has a lot of information. The other one that hasn't been featured is soulshepherding.org. Soulshepherding.org. There are 2 psychotherapists, both of them are Americans, they live in the States, and both of them are Christians, and God has called them to minister to Christian leaders in the body. That's what they do, and it's a brilliant resource. And there's also HopeMadeStrong.org. Both of them American organizations, they are unashamedly Christians, so they don't hide that. And then Anna Freud, just Papyrus, they are all very important resources. Just to round up to say that from what our experiences are, what are the things that we think that we respectfully think that as a church we should do, because we have statutory responsibility as a charity towards the people that we provide care for. One of them will be to consider general mental training for all our leaders and for our pastors. For instance, I attend the Bermondsey Church, and we have actually started that in Bermondsey. We have a mental support team. We have we've actually done mental training for all the. We had this mental Sunday actually where that was rolled out. Annual child protection for all our children workers is going to become statutory soon, when we'll be obligated to do those things. Because mental health is now something that is really very important globally. Appointment of mental leaders in branches, that's also something that we're advocating, that actually there should be somebody who is like a mental first aider, or somebody who is responsible for mental difficulties that the congregation might be encountering, and that we should have annual updates in our congregations. Thank you for listening. So we've got a minute and a half for questions. Okay, Sister.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this presentation. Thank you very much for this presentation. I've just completed my first aid youth mental health champion, so I can, stand as that. And I've just started a youth group for girls as well. And I asked them what are the things they would like us to start. And one of the things they did mention was self-care and mental health. And when we have the full session, you will be surprised what a child said to me. Sent me a private message. And she said, you mentioned some of the red flags. And she said she was experiencing those things that we mentioned. And guess how old is this child? 10 years. And she said, please, Auntie, don't tell my parents. So this is where I have the dilemma that, okay, I want to look after this child, but I still want the parents to be involved as well. How do I balance that? How do I go about it?
Well, we only have 4 seconds, so maybe something, those are things that when you have a mental health champion or someone in your congregation, you can go to them and find out what it is we can do, depending on the circumstance of that child. But you want to keep their trust and don't break it. Yeah?